Hello guys, and welcome to part 2 of this chapter, where I'm going to be discussing hair, clothes, and materials in the context of clothes mostly. Hair is a subject that I've had a lot of tutorial requests on. I've even done a little mini tutorial of sorts where I explain how I think about hair and how I draw it, which is up on my Instagram highlights at the time of recording. In here, I'm going to elaborate more on that and explain how I give the hair that I draw its sort of feel. To start with, I'm going to use this picture of a relatively simple hairstyle. It has nice lighting and you can clearly see the different strands of hair overlapping, which I'll use to illustrate my process. Now, in practice, I don't exactly follow these steps every single time. Again, this is just a depiction of what I'm thinking about when drawing hair. In theory, I start by having a base, the overall shape of the hair silhouette. From there, I create overlapping strands of hair, each working as its own separate section of sorts. This effect works because most hair tends to clump in sections that take different shapes and have different textures depending on the type of hair you're dealing with. It's almost like you're creating it from modeling clay at an initial stage. For this one, I'm going to go for a basic sort of mop-ish style where different strands have a simple band shape. Afterwards, I add more detail, which you can see in the green lines. A common thing that I see people do when drawing hair is adding too much detail or too uniform a detail, making the end result look a bit flat. Now, this is still a perfectly valid stylistic choice. There really isn't a right or wrong way to draw hair. Personally though, I'm a big fan of hairlines that bridge the gap between stylized and realistic, with a good balance between empty and full spaces. More detail is added closer to the edges of the strands or along the strands in opposite directions of them. Strands sort of give hair a sense of order, and additional details go in to give a sense of chaos within that order. The end result is neither too stylized nor too realistic and kind of leaves a lot of room for play. Here, I'll briefly mention the weight in the context of hair as a material. Now, hair has different consistencies, lengths, thickness, etc. on different people. For this one in particular, the hair's properties make it stick more to the top of the head, then fall in a mostly straightened fashion. You can tell it has weight pulling at the top, but at the same time it maintains some curvature and lightness. Another detail that I tend to think about is how these different strands overlap. In my opinion, overlapping strands of hair give a very satisfying note to whatever art style and reinforce the idea of thinking of hair strands as objects, pieces of clay, or bands at an early stage. Now I'm going to show and talk you through some more examples. Again, drawing hair isn't a science and there's no right or wrong way to do it. You could be extra nitpicky and get into the composition of hair and the physics behind it, but that's overkill even for somebody like me. I personally do it a lot by feel and intuition, and sometimes by just looking up references like the ones I'm about to show you. The first one is very straight hair. It falls very straightly as a unit with no volume or weight variation, and there's also no overlap of strands anywhere. For this one, the shape is very easy to get, and additional details are superfluous, only there to give it some texture and show where the starting point from which the hair falls off is. Next one has a little braid here, and that's basically why I added it in. The braid too can be seen as a separate object from the hair, the same way that loose strands can be compared to cloth bands. You can easily imagine the braid as the intertwining pieces of cloth or rope, whatever you compare it to. In shorter haircuts, it's harder to get the strand effects on, but it's still a fun and interesting thing to explore. This one is fine enough, but often it's hard to discern different chunks or strands in very short hair, as well as figure out its flow. Shorter hairstyles are, however, great practice in terms of learning where the hairline usually sits and to get you used to drawing the whole shape of the head before adding hair to it. Sometimes the back of the skull can become deformed in ways you don't intend if you draw the hair without having the bold base underneath. And then we've got a natural afro style hair, very puffy and with very voluminous shape. This is a great example of no matter the type or volume of hair, you can still tell strands apart and apply the 3-step process I showed earlier. The difference being that this time around we're more interested in giving each strand that curly, fluffy effect rather than have flow lines propagate throughout. This next one has very defined curls, resembling something of a distended spring or a gift wrapping. so it's relatively easy to split into strands and have them become more or less orderly as we go. For this next one, I mostly traced the outline and then deduced some curls for an extra swirly effect. It's similar to the previous one, but a bit more out of order due to its length and considerably messier / more chaotic. The last one is fully braided, which makes it one of the easiest to actually split into parts, but also a tricky one to get a balance on. Depending on the style and size of the braids, it might be best to split them or not. I did it for this case, and as a detail, I added texture lines along each one. And that's pretty much it for hair. I guess the main takeaway here is that hair isn't a unit. Even in this one that's more helmet-like, it's not a full unit. It takes shape and it deforms based on gravity or wind or whatever is affecting it. The way you can think about hair is the same way you think about a material, and that's why I lumped them together in this class. However, despite not being a unit, you can still think about it as a whole when it comes to its properties, look at its reaction to external stimuli. Things like water or gravity affect different hairstyles and different hair lengths in different ways, and understanding exactly how comes from observing or referencing a lot, and just guessing it from time to time. Now, clothes. I put clothes and materials all together because I'm not going to dedicate a whole section to materials in terms of their shape. Everything that's not cloth or fluid or soft material is basically going to be a hard material, which in most cases you can easily trace the outline of and design. For this part, I drew some clothes from some examples. I don't have rules for drawing clothes the same way I might do for hair or even anatomy. I did try to extend the idea I used for hair to here though, in terms of general shape and detailed deformations. Instead of additional details, I drew some arrows on them to indicate the areas on which the clothes are being pulled, by either gravity or the body itself, that causes them to gain a certain shape or deformation. The first example here is a cotton sweater of sorts, not too heavy and not too light, not too hard and not too soft. It can have deformation in some places, but a lot of the time it falls flat if there's nothing binding or pulling it. You'll usually get some deformation at the top where it falls towards the shoulders, near the sleeves, wrists, and the tighter part around the waist. The second example is sort of the same thing, with the cloth being a bit thicker in a way that doesn't allow it to pile up as much. You can still see that where the weight is applied. It's mostly straight, but then it kind of crumbles on the knees and at the bound ends. Next one is a very light, flowy type of dress, made even flowier by wind or motion like in this picture. It both has more deformation and less deformation than the previous ones, since it's a very malleable and easy to move around material, causing it to not have any form of permanent shape. If it's pulled against the skin, it'll take the shape of the body underneath, and you can see it here on the shoulder for instance. Adding detail in this type of clothing is very simple, but it can't just be all random. Areas inflated by the wind should have less creases, and areas where cloth lumps together can have many. Next up, normal shirt, straight pants. The pants are made of a harder material that seems to hardly deform at all, and doesn't adopt any discernible shape of the leg here. I'll use this as an example to highlight that even though the clothes are loose and shapeless enough that you could go without drawing the outline of the body underneath them, you should still do it whenever possible. Even for this type of clothing, it's useful to have an actual body as a base to understand how it falls on it. Next up is a very fluffy example where nothing really sticks to the body. It has its own shape and can be as chaotic in details as you'd like, since no matter the pose, the only parts that'll be deformed by the body underneath are the ones directly in contact with it. Lastly, I chose this jacket because it's both a very hard and a very deformed material. Because it's so hard and such a relatively tight fit, it'll bend and deform in a lot of places, less dependent on the effect of something like gravity than on the effect of the body pulling underneath. And that's the quick overview of how I draw these things and how I think about them. The best thing to do is look at references to practice and learn about clothes and fashion. I'm personally not big on this, so the only way I can draw modern looking clothes with any level of accuracy is usually by having a bunch of references up. From both a personal preference perspective and the perspective of somebody working on a long-form fantasy comic, simplifying clothes as much as possible is in my best interest, so I tend to oversee a lot of rules and strict details. There are plenty of artists out there that excel at this though, and plenty of great free tutorials that you can look up easily on specific types of cloth, folds, etc. Next video, we'll be looking at facial expressions. See you then!